We like to believe that good and evil are simple black and white concepts. Heroes stay heroes, and villains are born that way. But history, psychology, and real-life experiences tell a different story. Some of the most terrifying figures in history, people who committed unspeakable acts, were once ordinary, even kind individuals. What makes a good person cross the line into monstrosity? In this video, we'll explore the psychological, social, and philosophical forces that turn good people into terrifying monsters. It's easy to imagine that the people responsible for the most horrific acts in history were inherently evil, but the truth is far more complex. One of the most unsettling revelations in the study of human behavior is how ordinary individuals, placed in the right or wrong circumstances, can commit horrific acts without any intention of malice. This phenomenon was famously explored by philosopher and political theorist Hannah Arendt in her study of Adolf Eichmann, one of the primary architects of the Holocaust. Eichmann, Arendt observed, was not a psychopath or sadist. He was a bureaucrat. He wasn't driven by a hatred of Jews or a desire to destroy them. Instead, he justified his actions with the idea that he was simply following orders, fulfilling his duties as a government official. He wasn't a monster in the traditional sense. He was a man who dehumanized others because he compartmentalized his personal beliefs from his professional duties. In fact, Eichmann seemed almost disturbingly ordinary, a man who could sit in a courtroom and offer the same polite pleasantries as any average civil servant. This disconnect between the person and the action is what Arendt called the banality of evil. The core of Eichmann's evil lies in his complete abdication of moral responsibility. By immersing himself in a system of orders, rules, and hierarchy, he stripped away his personal agency. He became a cog in a monstrous machine, no different from the many others who carried out similar duties during times of war and oppression. In Eichmann's mind, it wasn't about his personal beliefs or desires. It was about performing his task in a manner that met the expectations of those above him. He didn't actively wish for harm, yet his complacency allowed atrocities to occur on a scale never before seen in human history. This is not an isolated case. The banality of evil is a global phenomenon, and it transcends time and culture. From the soldiers who committed war crimes to ordinary citizens who justified slavery and segregation, history is filled with examples of people who committed atrocities not out of malice, but through a willingness to dehumanize others in order to fit in, follow orders, or maintain social order. This troubling reality forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that anyone, good, ordinary people, can be complicit in unimaginable acts of violence simply by surrendering their moral judgment to external authorities. The idea that people can justify atrocious behavior because of a perceived duty to a higher authority or social construct is central to understanding why good people turn into terrifying monsters. This dynamic can take shape in the form of soldiers, police officers, and even regular citizens who participate in systemic violence because they believe it is necessary for the greater good. When morality becomes relative, when people lose sight of the humanity of others, they are more prone to becoming agents of destruction. Groupthink is a psychological phenomenon that explains how individuals can be swayed into committing extreme actions by the influence of a group. At its core, groupthink occurs when the desire for harmony or conformity within a group results in irrational or dysfunctional decision-making. This occurs because individuals prioritize the cohesion and approval of the group over their personal beliefs, leading them to go along with decisions they would never make on their own. The power of groupthink is evident in many historical atrocities. The Rwandan genocide, for example, was the result of a political and social climate where individuals, once shielded from the violence, became complicit in horrific acts of violence because they were part of a larger, cohesive force. The people who participated in the slaughter were not all driven by deep-rooted hatred. Many were regular citizens who, under intense pressure and in the context of mob mentality, chose to follow along with the group. Once the idea that mass violence was the accepted behavior took root, it became nearly impossible for individuals to stand apart without facing social exclusion, even violent retribution. The fear of becoming an outcast, of being seen as a traitor to one's people, often trumps moral concerns. The collective we becomes a justification for action, even when that action is inherently wrong. This is the essence of how good people can become terrifying monsters. They lose their sense of individuality and instead conform to the collective will of the group. They stop questioning their behavior because they are part of a unified entity with a common goal, and that goal often overrides personal ethics. It is easier, psychologically, to follow along with a group than to stand out and risk being ostracized. As a result, ordinary individuals can become instruments of terror simply by adhering to the group's shared ideology or purpose. A more modern example of this can be seen in online mobs and cancel culture. The anonymity and distance provided by digital platforms make it easier for people to participate in collective condemnation without truly reflecting on the consequences of their actions. In these cases, groupthink manifests as an emotional, almost visceral drive to conform to the opinions and actions of the majority, often without considering whether the targets of the mob truly deserve it. Individuals who might otherwise have resisted joining in find themselves swept along by the force of the crowd, losing sight of the humanity of those they condemn. This illustrates just how powerful groupthink is, as it allows people to rationalize their behavior and dehumanize others, turning them from individuals into cogs in a collective machinery of harm. Groupthink also manifests in corporate and organizational settings, where employees and leaders act in ways they would not if they were outside the group dynamic. When corporate cultures promote unethical practices or encourage blind loyalty, people begin to disregard moral consequences. From corporate fraud to environmental degradation, individuals can easily justify harmful actions if they believe the group will support them and if they feel insulated from the immediate repercussions of their behavior. Ultimately, the phenomenon of groupthink demonstrates how much influence others can have over an individual's morality. It's not just about blindly following orders. It's about how the collective identity and cohesion of a group can overpower individual ethical reasoning. The need to belong, the fear of exclusion, and the pressure to conform can all turn well-meaning individuals into active participants in horrifying actions, transforming them into the terrifying monsters they once could never have imagined themselves becoming. The transformation from a good person into a terrifying monster often begins with trauma. Whether it's inflicted through childhood abuse, war, or personal betrayal, trauma has the power to shape the psyche in ways that are not always immediately visible. While not everyone who experiences trauma becomes violent or cruel, it can alter the way an individual views the world, relationships, and themselves. Trauma rewires the brain, affecting decision-making, emotional regulation, and the capacity for empathy. One of the clearest ways in which trauma manifests is through a breakdown in trust. Children, in particular, are vulnerable to experiencing trauma that affects their ability to trust others, especially caregivers. When a child is neglected, abused, or witnesses violence, their view of the world can become one of constant danger. This sense of insecurity and fear born from early experiences, doesn't always heal with time. It lingers, often surfacing later in life in unhealthy ways. As adults, these individuals may find themselves struggling with intense emotional reactions or forming toxic, untrustworthy relationships. Trauma-induced behavior often stems from the need for survival. A person who has been repeatedly hurt might develop strategies to protect themselves, but these strategies, although they may work in the short term, can damage their long-term well-being. For instance, someone who was raised in an abusive household may learn to suppress their emotions or react with disproportionate anger when they feel threatened. Over time, this person may begin to view the world through a lens of suspicion, reacting aggressively or manipulatively to perceived slights, even when those slights may not exist. It's not that they've lost their empathy. Rather, they've learned to mistrust the motives of others, and in doing so, they begin to rationalize harmful behavior as a form of self-defense. In extreme cases, trauma can push an individual towards a darker path. When a person has experienced significant emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, they might start to view the world as a place where only the strong survive. This mentality can breed a sense of powerlessness, leading them to seek control in unhealthy ways. They may begin to dominate others, whether through manipulation, coercion, or even violence. What was once a vulnerable, compassionate individual may begin to adopt behaviors rooted in cruelty, all driven by the need to regain control over their environment. As these individuals gain more power, they may justify their actions as a way to protect themselves from being hurt again, even if that means inflicting pain on others. Trauma doesn't just change how people behave in relationships or personal encounters. It can fundamentally alter the way they see themselves. One of the most insidious effects of trauma is the internalization of shame. Survivors of childhood abuse, for example, often carry a heavy sense of worthlessness, believing that they deserve the pain they've endured. This deep-seated shame may be expressed outwardly in self-destructive behavior, but in some cases, it can transform into anger that's projected onto others. Rather than confront their own pain, these individuals might become perpetrators of the very same cruelty they once suffered. This cycle of abuse is not only a personal tragedy, but also a societal one, as it perpetuates a pattern of violence that spans generations. In cases of complex trauma, which occurs over long periods or multiple instances of abuse, this dynamic can become even more pronounced. As a child suffers repeated abuse or neglect, they begin to lose their sense of self-worth, seeing themselves as unworthy of love or kindness. As they grow older, their interactions with others may reflect this belief. They might struggle to form healthy relationships, viewing vulnerability as a weakness and controlling others as a way to stave off further pain. The coping mechanisms they develop may turn into destructive habits, substance abuse, manipulative behavior, or even violent tendencies. The mind's ability to dissociate is another consequence of trauma that can lead a person down a dark path. When the brain is faced with overwhelming pain, it may shut off from reality as a way of surviving the emotional distress. Dissociation allows the individual to escape their feelings, but over time, it can create a dangerous separation between the self and their actions. Someone who has dissociated from their emotions may feel less connected to the pain they are causing others. They may engage in cruelty without fully recognizing or caring about the consequences. The disconnection from their own feelings makes it easier for them to rationalize harmful behaviors, as they no longer experience the immediate guilt or shame that might otherwise stop them. Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, is another condition closely tied to the transformation of a good person into a monster. PTSD often develops after an individual has witnessed or experienced a life-threatening event. The trauma leaves an indelible mark on the psyche, often leading to flashbacks, hypervigilance, and an inability to trust others. People with PTSD might react aggressively to perceived threats, even when no actual threat exists. This heightened state of alertness makes it difficult to live peacefully with others. In some cases, people with PTSD may turn violent as a way of protecting themselves or even preemptively attacking others before they themselves can be harmed. The social and cultural impact of trauma cannot be overstated. In environments where violence and trauma are normalized, such as in war zones or abusive communities, the effects of trauma are often compounded. Survivors of such environments may struggle to reintegrate into peaceful societies, finding it difficult to trust others or function in a way that aligns with social norms. In these cases, the individual may resort to violence as a way of coping with a world that feels hostile and unpredictable. This is not always an immediate shift into monstrosity, but a slow, gradual erosion of empathy and personal morality, driven by years of exposure to trauma. The cycle of trauma, violence, and re-traumatization is especially dangerous because it creates a feedback loop. The more trauma a person experiences, the more likely they are to inflict harm on others, which in turn increases the likelihood of future trauma. Children who grow up in violent households are more likely to become violent adults, perpetuating the same behavior that was inflicted upon them. They may not recognize the emotional scars they carry, and they may pass them on to the next generation, continuing the cycle of pain and destruction. This generational trauma is a powerful force that shapes communities, cultures, and even entire societies, creating environments in which violence becomes a way of life. This deep, pervasive trauma is often invisible to the outside world. People who have suffered trauma are not always outwardly monstrous or violent. Many live quiet lives, keeping their pain hidden from others. But when the right triggers surface, the consequences of unresolved trauma can be devastating. The trauma that once lurked beneath the surface, hidden away, can emerge in unexpected and destructive ways. It can transform someone who once felt compassion and empathy into someone capable of inflicting unspeakable harm on others. The process is gradual, often unnoticed, until it is too late. The once kind individual may no longer recognize their own humanity or the humanity of those around them. And this is when the monster within begins to emerge. Power has an undeniable effect on human behavior. The ability to control, manipulate, and dominate others can corrupt even the most morally grounded individuals. The famous observation by Lord Acton, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely," captures the essence of this transformation. When individuals are granted power, especially unchecked authority, they are often not only tempted, but compelled to abuse it. This phenomenon is not limited to tyrants or dictators. It permeates every level of society, from corporate boardrooms to political offices to social dynamics within small groups. One of the most chilling examples of power's corrupting influence is the story of the Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted in 1971 by psychologist Philip Zimbardo. The experiment, designed to explore the psychological effects of perceived power, involved college students taking on the roles of either guards or prisoners in a simulated prison environment. Within a matter of days, the guards, initially ordinary students, began to display extreme cruelty and sadism toward the prisoners, subjecting them to humiliation, emotional abuse, and even physical punishment. The experiment was meant to last 2 weeks, but was cut short after only 6 days because of the extreme behavior exhibited by the guards. Despite the fact that these were normal, well-adjusted individuals before the experiment began, the power dynamics of the situation caused them to devolve into tormentors. The psychological effects of power were so profound that even those who initially resisted the authority of their role became complicit in the abuse. The experiment illustrated that the mere presence of power could lead to horrific behavior, even in those who would otherwise be considered good people. This capacity for corruption doesn't just emerge in isolated experiments. It's evident in real-world scenarios where individuals are placed in positions of power. Political leaders, for example, often start their careers with noble intentions, aiming to serve their constituents or improve society. However, once they are entrenched in power, the mechanisms of authority begin to shape their actions. The temptation to maintain power, whether for personal gain or out of a belief that the ends justify the means, can override their original ethical values. The fear of losing power, of no longer being in control, often leads leaders to take extreme actions to hold on to their position. Corruption becomes institutionalized as leaders create systems that favor their own interests and silence dissent. This is evident in many autocratic regimes throughout history, where leaders who once sought justice or fairness turn into tyrants who justify oppression through the very same power they once sought to wield for good. The shift from good to evil in the face of power is not always abrupt. It is often gradual and insidious. As individuals in positions of authority experience the benefits of power, their moral compass can begin to shift. Initially, the use of power may be justified as necessary for maintaining order or achieving progress. However, as individuals become more accustomed to their authority, they begin to see themselves as above reproach, immune to criticism or accountability. This sense of invulnerability leads to increasingly unethical behavior. The actions that once would have seemed reprehensible or unjustifiable become easier to rationalize. After all, they believe they are the ones in control, and they begin to view their decisions as infallible. This is the core of the hubris that often accompanies the abuse of power. When individuals begin to believe their own superiority, both morally and intellectually, over others, power also distorts an individual's perception of the world around them. When someone is granted authority, their sense of perspective narrows. The higher one rises in a hierarchy, the further removed they become from the experiences of the people they govern or influence. This detachment from reality fosters an environment where empathy can wither. Leaders who are insulated from the struggles of the average person may fail to see or care about the consequences of their actions on others. They can rationalize decisions that harm people because they are no longer directly experiencing the pain or suffering that those decisions cause. The social distance between the powerful and the powerless creates an environment where moral considerations are disregarded, and the welfare of others becomes secondary to the pursuit of control and influence. Moreover, power can lead to the erosion of accountability. When a person's authority is not checked by other systems or individuals, there is little to stop them from abusing their power. Political systems without checks and balances, corporate environments where leaders are unchallenged, and abusive familial or social structures all create spaces where individuals with power can act without consequence. This is why tyrants often surround themselves with sycophants and yes-men, individuals who will not question or challenge their authority. By cultivating an environment of unquestioning loyalty, the person in power can continue their abusive behavior without fear of reprisal. Those who are subjected to the whims of the powerful are left voiceless, unable to challenge the status quo for fear of retribution. The psychological effects of power extend beyond just the person wielding it. Those who are subjected to the power dynamics are also affected. The abused or oppressed may start to internalize the dehumanization imposed upon them. When people are treated as lesser, their ability to see themselves as equals to those in power is diminished. They may begin to accept the status quo, becoming complicit in their own oppression. In extreme cases, those who are oppressed may come to believe they deserve to be in that position, further entrenching the power dynamics and perpetuating the cycle of control and subjugation. The powerful, in turn, justify their behavior by reinforcing the belief that those beneath them are inferior, further enabling their own sense of superiority and entitlement. This toxic dynamic is not limited to authoritarian regimes or abusive relationships. It can be found in corporate environments where leaders make decisions based on profit rather than people. In these settings, power is often used to exploit workers, manipulate markets, and disregard ethical considerations. CEOs and executives, once starting their careers with a drive for innovation and success, can become consumed by the desire for wealth and power. Their decisions, once rooted in personal integrity, can shift as they become more entrenched in their position. Corporate culture can reinforce this shift by rewarding those who prioritize power and profits over ethical considerations. The longer someone holds power, the more difficult it becomes to see the world through any other lens, until their behavior reflects the very corruption they once sought to avoid. At its most extreme, unchecked power can manifest in the actions of dictators who commit atrocities in the name of national security, racial purity, or ideological superiority. These leaders justify mass violence and oppression as necessary steps for the greater good of their nation or people, despite the immense suffering they cause. The belief that one's vision of the world is the only correct one can lead to catastrophic consequences. Leaders who once valued freedom, equality, and justice can, over time, embrace repression, censorship, and violence as the only means of preserving their vision. In such cases, power has completely corrupted their moral compass, and their actions become increasingly monstrous as they see themselves as the savior of a cause, regardless of the human cost. The story of the corrupting influence of power is a cautionary tale. It shows that no one is immune to the effects of power. The temptation to abuse it, to justify cruelty for the sake of maintaining control, is ever present. The good intentions that accompany the ascent to power can be gradually eroded by the corrupting forces of greed, pride, and fear. And when those in power begin to believe they are above reproach, the consequences can be disastrous, not only for them, but for everyone around them. The transformation from good to monstrous is often a slow, insidious process, one that happens quietly and unnoticed until it is too late to reverse. The loss of empathy is one of the most chilling aspects of how good people can turn into terrifying monsters. Empathy, the ability to understand and share the feelings of another, is what often separates us from barbaric or destructive behavior. It is the thread that connects us to our shared humanity and prevents us from seeing others merely as objects to be used, manipulated, or discarded. However, empathy is not a constant, unchangeable trait. It is malleable, shaped by experiences, environments, and the emotional and psychological state of an individual. In situations where empathy is gradually diminished or intentionally suppressed, people can commit horrific acts without the remorse or guilt that might otherwise prevent them from doing so. One of the most common ways empathy is eroded is through dehumanization. This occurs when an individual or group is seen as less than human, often as a result of being classified as other. This can happen in many different contexts. A person in a position of power may see those under their authority as objects or subordinates, while a society struggling with racial, ethnic, or religious divisions may view an entire group as inferior or expendable. Once this dehumanization takes place, empathy becomes harder to feel or express. After all, if the other is not fully human in the eyes of those in power, there is no need to consider their suffering, desires, or needs. This allows for the justification of actions that would otherwise be unconscionable. The brutal treatment of people in genocides, wars, and other acts of systemic violence is often rooted in this very process. Once a group is dehumanized, its members become targets for cruelty and exploitation, and the perpetrators of this violence can act without the burden of guilt. This dehumanization is not always deliberate or overt. Often it takes place subtly through the use of language and imagery. Propaganda is one of the most powerful tools for dehumanization, and it has been used throughout history to paint entire populations as subhuman or undeserving of basic rights. The rhetoric used by those in power to describe their enemies, whether it's calling them vermin, parasites, or enemies of the state, works to strip away the individuality of those being targeted. By labeling them with these terms, the perpetrators can distance themselves emotionally from the consequences of their actions. The people they harm are no longer seen as individuals with their own thoughts, emotions, and lives, but as objects to be eradicated for the greater good or for the protection of society. Dehumanization can also occur within smaller groups, particularly in situations where there is intense competition, conflict, or ideological polarization. In the workplace, for example, the hierarchical structure can cause employees to see one another as obstacles to personal success, rather than as colleagues or human beings with their own struggles and emotions. In political environments, partisanship can turn individuals into caricatures of the enemy, causing people to dismiss the legitimacy of opposing views and dismiss the humanity of those with whom they disagree. This kind of emotional detachment, when left unchecked, can escalate into cruelty, manipulation, or exploitation, as empathy for others becomes less relevant. Another way that empathy can be eroded is through the process of moral disengagement. This is the psychological mechanism that allows individuals to engage in harmful or unethical behavior without feeling the usual moral discomfort or guilt. Moral disengagement involves a set of rationalizations that allow people to justify their actions, even when they know deep down that what they're doing is wrong. This can include displacing responsibility onto others, such as claiming that I was just following orders, or de-individualizing victims, as in the case of seeing them as faceless, nameless enemies rather than human beings with families and lives of their own. It can also involve minimizing the harm caused, such as telling oneself that the victims deserved it, or that their suffering is an unfortunate but necessary part of a larger goal. One of the key components of moral disengagement is the ability to ignore or downplay the emotional consequences of one's actions. People who engage in harmful behavior often do so because they are able to block out the emotional impact of their actions, making it easier to commit atrocities without confronting the moral implications. This process is especially pronounced in environments where violence, mistreatment, or cruelty are normalized. Soldiers in wartime, for example, may become desensitized to the suffering around them, particularly if they are exposed to violence on a daily basis. Over time, their ability to empathize with the enemy diminishes, and they may come to see their actions as justified, even righteous, regardless of the harm caused. While moral disengagement can allow individuals to carry out horrific acts, it is important to note that it often occurs gradually. People rarely wake up one day and decide to become cruel or violent. Instead, it is a process that unfolds over time, starting with small justifications and gradually escalating until an individual becomes capable of actions they would once have considered unthinkable. This incremental erosion of empathy is one of the reasons why individuals in positions of power or authority can become so dangerous. What might begin as a single moral compromise can snowball into a pattern of increasingly destructive behavior. Another factor that contributes to the loss of empathy is emotional numbing. In environments where individuals are exposed to prolonged stress, trauma, or hardship, they can become emotionally numb as a way of coping with the overwhelming emotional burden. Police officers, healthcare workers, and others who regularly encounter suffering and death are particularly vulnerable to this kind of emotional detachment. At first, their empathy may be a powerful motivating force in their work, driving them to protect, heal, or support others. But over time, constant exposure to pain and suffering can wear them down, and they may begin to shut off their emotions to preserve their own mental health. This emotional numbing can have serious consequences, not just for the individual, but for those they interact with. The ability to connect with and care for others diminishes, and in its place is a cold, detached sense of duty that can lead to harmful or even monstrous actions. This process of emotional numbing is particularly dangerous when it is coupled with a lack of external accountability. When individuals do not feel the weight of their actions, or when they are in environments where ethical concerns are ignored or dismissed, they are more likely to engage in behaviors that are harmful to others. The longer someone remains in an emotionally numbed or morally disengaged state, the harder it becomes to reconnect with the empathy that once guided their decisions. Eventually, the ability to see others as human beings with inherent worth may disappear entirely, replaced by a cold pragmatism that justifies cruelty. This loss of empathy is not always a result of external pressure or difficult circumstances. Sometimes, it is an internal shift that occurs when an individual becomes consumed by their own sense of power, entitlement, or self-interest. Narcissism, for example, can play a significant role in the erosion of empathy. Narcissists who prioritize their own needs and desires above those of others are often incapable of understanding or caring about the emotions of those around them. Their inability to see others as equal human beings often leads them to exploit or manipulate people for personal gain. As their sense of superiority grows, their empathy diminishes until they are capable of treating others with complete disregard. This is particularly evident in cases where individuals with narcissistic tendencies rise to positions of power, as their lack of empathy makes them more likely to make decisions that harm others without feeling any moral conflict. In sum, the loss of empathy is a gradual but powerful force that can transform an ordinary person into someone capable of monstrous behavior. Whether through dehumanization, moral disengagement, emotional numbing, or narcissism, the erosion of empathy creates a vacuum in which cruelty can thrive. Without the capacity to understand the pain and suffering of others, individuals become more susceptible to engaging in behavior that is harmful, abusive, or even violent. The process is slow, often imperceptible, but it leads to a profound change in the way an individual views and treats others. And when empathy is gone, so too is the barrier that separates human beings from monsters.